whatever feedback to the audience. So the question is, what happened with missing data? And maybe you guys have had more experience with missing data. So maybe you can comment.
Lots of my data goes missing.
Yeah?
Yeah. All six.
When data goes bad? Okay, so I'll say a few probably relatively simple things, and then I'll pass it to someone else who can say something more complicated. So the missing data, just to clarify, in machine learning we tend to classify missing data into three categories: missing completely at random, missing at random, and missing not at random. So missing completely at random states, someone correct me if I get this wrong, but I'm pretty sure. Missing completely at random states that essentially it's like a random, maybe biased coin as to whether or not this particular thing is missing, and it doesn't pertain to anything else. That's missing completely at random. Missing at random states that whether or not it's missing is a function of the other observed variables only. And missing not at random states that whether or not it's missing is actually a function of things you may have not observed. Okay. Or at least things you may not observe that are correlated with the variables of interest. Okay. So the first and second cases are actually equivalently equal. Most machine learning algorithms don't care. Most machine learning algorithms assume that it's missing at random or completely at random, and that's fine. And the problem typically with clinical data is actually it's missing not at random, in that there was something else that was important that you didn't observe, but that let's say the doctor did observe, and that chose whether or not to take this test or something else. So the easiest naive way around that is then you add some other hidden, let's say you have a dynamic system model, because that's what I do. So then you add another random variable that states whether or not this thing has been observed. And now, conditional on whether or not it's observed, it's not missing at random or not. And then you're sort of modeling this process of whether or not the thing's observed as well, which makes the whole problem more complicated. And then just quickly before I pass it off, on the subject of bad data, I think Stuart Russell actually did a reasonable job of describing the kinds of models that you might be able to produce there. So you need to model, if you wanted to produce a model, as opposed to doing something else, because Eamon's going to have a different opinion, you produce a model of like why this thing might have gone bad, right? The measurement device fell out of the arm or something else, and now you're trying to reason about that as well. And that, in my experience reading literature stuff, that's been reasonably successful if you have some prior knowledge to add. Okay, so I'll stop with that.
I guess Christian covered a lot of it. One thing I wanted to say, and this is more on the practical side from clinical systems, is we've talked to multiple different ICUs that have this issue as well, is data is often, in our systems, what we found was the data would be recorded, dumped every 6 to 8 hours, but the baby could have been moved to a different bed, but the data is being recorded as if it's from the same baby at the previous bed. Does it make sense? Or the baby could have been transferred, and now the data is getting recorded at 2 different places, as if there's a ghost baby sitting somewhere. So this is only one example of things like that we saw, that there isn't much to say other than that these things exist. So when yesterday we talked a great deal about putting data in the cloud and consolidating data from 100 different places, the thing is there are lots of things like this we saw that happen frequently, and if we didn't know about the source of the data or didn't know what was the process of data collection, then we would be getting and making inferences on a lot of data that is bad or it's just wrong. So at Stanford, we built like an entity resolution model to fix this, because there was no identifier. So you had to look at the data and establish consistency to be able to know that this baby indeed has moved, and this data that's collecting is ghost data that doesn't belong, or it belongs to a different baby who was actually moved also. So anyway, so that's just something that happens a lot. And a lot of the missing data can then be resolved as well, because it could be saying it's missing, but it's just because they didn't record the big move, something like that.
The thing I would add at a very high level from a data mining point of view is, as I mentioned in my talk, some people in data mining try to explain all the data. And in the best case, that's hard. But when you have missing or noisy or corrupt data, it's particularly brittle to that kind of distortion. So algorithms that explain only part of data and basically give up on the rest are much more likely to be robust to these kind of corrupt data.
I guess I have one other thing to add, which is that this isn't the only domain in which the data is bad. It may be worse here, But it's not alone. Machine learning has been, or data mining has been successfully applied to many situations where the data is noisy and stuff. And that's why you use a probabilistic model or a robust model of some form, is because you don't believe that actually everything's there. You may be more attuned to it because people's lives are at stake, so you really notice that the data is poor. But one of the things, well, you get a lot more of it, and the errors average out or something like that. So it's not insurmountable. It has to be addressed, and it has to be addressed well. But you shouldn't give up on it. It's been successfully applied many places that have bad data. People hand enter things that are bad in all kinds of different fields, not just in medicine.
Yeah, but not your ICU.
Okay, was there another question over here? Okay, so you have a question?
Yeah, this is a little bit different, but we work in a lot of other fields. A lot of the data analysis that you're describing is what I would call basically two-dimensional data. You're looking at data over a period of time. We have some other problems, completely different domain, where we map three-dimensional data into two dimensions and come up with a representation that looks very, very much like what you see, or speech pattern, or anything like that. That would be the time domain. And what we're actually mapping is the three-dimensional structure of proteins into a one-to-one mapping. Now, the reason I'm asking about this is we start to see how we do the same kind of analysis for structural features that you're doing to do feature extraction. But having done that, to find what we would consider the base pattern for tiling that, which is again the way I see a lot of feature extraction you're doing, what we also know is because of the three-dimensional structure of the protein, there's higher order interactions. And I was wondering how much you actually look for higher order interactions, so it's order of features that are separated, to try to use that to be more predictive as well.
Even when you did MDL, I think you used recursively or not?
No, those examples weren't recursive. So I think in principle, I don't know much about the domain. I have looked at similar kinds of problems, actually with DNA strings. So although they're symbolic, you can actually make them to time series in a very trivial trick. And as you know, most of DNA, unfortunately, is nonsense, right? 99% of it. But with something like motif discovery, you can potentially find little gems, which you just then give labels to, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then you can look for patterns at a higher order in that. And there are lots of higher order algorithms that look at that, like association rules or what have you. So there's no magic bullet for this. If you can find some features that are meaningful and you give them to some higher order algorithm, you're probably in good shape. But finding the meaningful features in the first place is the tricky part, typically.
Yeah, and one of the problems that we realize when we're looking at data that everyone said we should convert it into applied time series is because we know something about the biological function, which is that
It isn't necessary that that would be the case. So there's an insertion of an amino acid length in time series or add noise. So the tricks I showed you earlier on were for mostly Euclidean distance, but you can make Euclidean distance somewhat invariant to this kind of warping or uniform scaling. So with a little bit of extra work, it actually should be possible to do that.
Other questions? Yes.
Has Stanford been, have they deployed your model?
So we've not tried to deploy it within the monitor. We're talking to the monitoring companies to see if there are different monitoring companies that are interested in taking this and deploying it. But what we want to do before we deploy it is to find another, because that would mean a software iteration within Philips, which is not within our means or control. But what we can do is basically we're trying to take a two-pronged approach. One, have a monitor company take this, deploy it. But two, have a different ICU where they're trying to collect data like this and see if we can prospectively validate things there, which is something much easier for us to do. And then it would be even more convincing for the monitoring companies to take this and deploy it.
Are there other questions? Yeah?
The question which is maybe in a kind of different direction, but most of the talks here kind of are talking about feature extraction and identifying features. What do you think is the direction? Is the direction exactly this feature extraction, data mining, or should there be more effort spent on understanding what is the dynamics and what is the kind of physiology effects that kind of generate this?
Briefly, from my point of view, I'm not an expert in medicine by any means, but I like initially to be agnostic to the data. So in many cases when I work with somebody, I tell them, don't tell me what the data is. I just don't want to know. And I try to do an initial pass to see what regularities and structure I can find. And then I show it to them as a kind of a sanity check. And that's actually very useful for me. It prevents me from overfitting or put my biases into the data. But there's no doubt in these domains that you need the expert because I might find a cool pattern, and it turns out actually simply the shift change, the nurses change and sign off, right? It's a new pattern, but it's not very interesting or novel. So I think this actually really does need humans in the loop to guide the feature extraction. I think there's no way to avoid that.
I have a question related to the last question. There's been some recent work positing that the purpose of the model is important, whether your model is there for understanding or for prediction, and asserting that a model that may be good for prediction may not be good for comprehension and vice versa. I was wondering if you might comment on that.
I can comment on that. So, in situations where you have large amounts of labeled data, I think often you fall into a very supervised approach to doing things because that's what gives you the best results. So what I mean by supervised here is not just, I use a linear predictor. I may have some complex structure, which I may choose in advance, but I have a lot of parameters, and those parameters are going to be tuned in order to optimize whatever performance I actually care about. And then when you have very little data, especially very little labeled data, then you go to the other end where you're like, well, how does the system work physically? And okay, I'm going to model that, and I'm going to derive from the model various predictions as best I can. And I think that's just kind of it's very natural because it's a question about how much data you have available. So up above, I tried to kind of write down different levels of optimization that you commonly encounter of using data, right? And then sort of all the way from handcrafted model with handcrafted parameters to end-to-end optimization of reward and loss. We saw 0 examples of the last one in the health domain. And Stuart was partly in 1 and partly in 2. He was doing a little bit of tuning of the parameters. Suchi was in 3 of these categories, I think. So she had handcrafted structures with parameters learned by data fitting. She had structure and parameters learned by data fitting. And she also had some handcrafted structure with parameters learned to optimize some approximately real reward loss. Okay? And then Christian and Iman were at level 3, structure and parameters learned by data fitting. So I guess that's kind of where we are. I think data quality is a very serious issue. It seems like that's biting a lot, which forces you towards the upper categories. And as data quality improves, then you can start shifting towards the lower categories. Like, for example, if Suchi had 100 times more data, I bet that she could take a lot of the parameters that she's currently kind of trying to model and just tune them directly to improve her loss, and that would help.
And this is the paradox that producers understand is if you have lots of noise in your data, you're going to be better off with a simple linear model than one that is theoretically leveraged.
That's
bias.
yeah. There's sort of two things here. One of them is if you model badly, then you're exposed. If you model well, that can reduce the number of labels you need in order to predict well. And I guess if you have an enormous number of labels, you can model terribly and still predict pretty well. Because you can, if you get an enormous number of features, then you can just kind of manage to essentially memorize what the right answer is. Right? So, yeah.
There's a point there about the complexity of your model versus the quality and quantity of data. And I think all the methods here have what would be called capacity control or that sort of thing, in that they all naturally adapt the complexity of the model in some way, sometimes it's more obvious than others, to the amount of data that's there. So MDL, as an example, does this by, if it has this natural method of how well I can compress the thing, and if I have enough data to be more certain of the compression, I'll actually do it. And if I don't, then I'll have a simpler model. Right, and in my case, the structures are actually learned. You learn links if you think you have enough data to actually support that the causality exists. I had it. I know you're. Oh, well, for instance, the ridge regression Suchi was using is the same side of things. So I think that's pretty standard, but it doesn't get around the whole thing. But that's very standard in machine learning literature, is to have your algorithm naturally kind of understand a little bit at least about how complex it can make it given the noise and the quantity of the data.
I do want to add one thing, which I think we don't do as much. So there is very principled work in the machine learning community where you try to improve both generative and discriminative performance simultaneously on the data, which means you try to both understand the data really well as improve accuracy on a particular task. You can do that. The other thing, so that's possible, but in the very least, one thing that I think is going to be very useful for clinical data sets, so this is from my experience, limited experience, is being able to take this data and form intelligent dimensionality reduction methods. So intelligent, what I mean by that is basically using some sort of clinical bias, if there is relevant clinical bias that you're sure about, to be able to reduce the dimensionality of the data to come up with interesting nonlinear representations that are succinct. And then being able to use that to summarize, now you've summarized a lot of data in some intelligent way, and then using that within prediction tasks. And I think you could do this all as part of one big framework, but then the two-phase thing I also think works really well. And it's useful because...
I think the two-phase approach is extremely helpful when you have relatively small amounts of labeled data. I think that's essentially the only approach which really works. Even when you have nominally supervised data sets, like some of the small UCI data sets, what happened there was they're intended to be used, it's just, here's a bunch of labeled data and you learn to predict well. But the features there were carefully handcrafted in order to make the prediction tasks solvable by people who knew about the problem at hand. And this looks like that's happening here. Yeah?
I have two remarks questions to throw together. One is, for example, we look at brain injury monitoring, right? And just on the data issue, you might look at the time series, but suddenly you find something dropping down, and you might wonder why it's happening. Maybe there's an injection. So part of it is, in terms of missing data, tracking, I think, the interventions carefully. So when you say data, it's a totality of things, I think, not just the observations that you think of usually, but a whole variety of things which feed into them, I think. So that's one thing you want to be careful about, but I think that's where the domain modeling becomes very critical as a model. That's one point. The second part of it is, even if you have lots of data, and I'm going to think not medical, but go to the other extreme. Let's assume I'm looking at a particle motion, right? And I didn't know I equals MA. Then I could sort of analyze the hell out of it and try to find essentially I'm trying to rederive or reobtain Newton's laws of motion, right? But if I knew they existed, this is the physiology or the structural modeling based on the medical or biological principles, certainly I think it will become much more effective. So I think you do want to think of some sort of structural or domain-based models, and then look at the residual, and then try to model that if you want to be most effective at it.
Not really. Yeah, bias variance is almost the same thing as overfitting. So it's already been talked about. Okay, so there's different levels of data drivenness. That's an important topic here. What is the appropriate method for experimentation? Is another. Wait, should we go back? You had a question.
Well, I actually had a question that I don't know if it fits this category or not, but it has to do with when we talk about modeling in here. We've talked about being able to predict things, and my understanding is that predicting things that happen regularly is a lot easier than rare event prediction.
Oh yeah.
So I'm personally interested in rare event prediction. I mean, cardiac arrests happen, but if you look at when they happen in an ICU, it's 1 out of 300,000 times. So how do you go about that?
You go about
Are we
rare
using
event
the right
prediction.
sets of tools that you're talking about, or is there a different set of tools to be used?
So I think having lots and lots of data helps a lot when you deal with rare events. And that is one of the things which really helps. In terms of the methods, I don't know. You guys have
I mean, yeah, in some sense, if it's rare, then you don't observe it so much, and so you need more data to observe it more often. The other thing to do is to clump them together and say, I'm not trying to predict whether or not the cardiac event happens, or whether or not something weird is going to happen. And now that weird category has more data in it, and maybe that's okay, maybe because it's just outside of the normal, and it's just outside of the normal. So, I mean, it's the same thing. I'm just trying to get more data out of the same thing. As to say, if you're willing to relax your problem, just say, okay, with probability 5 or 0.5 or something, we're headed outside of normal, and I can't tell you where. That might be easier than saying exactly where, and so maybe that's another way of trying to get more data for the same problem.
So this basic strategy, I think, is a good one. So if you have a category which is extremely rare, maybe it's in a bigger category which is not so rare, and then an even bigger category which is maybe fairly common. And then you first predict this, and then you try to predict the residual. You use this as sort of the offset for predicting this, and this is the offset for predicting that. And that can be an effective strategy. Yeah?
So this is a question just like, for example, when I work with medical data and I try to apply, say, supervised learning, there's all these parameters you tweak, and you don't really understand. And if I'm uncomfortable doing that, how would you expect like physicians to be comfortable doing something like that? Or like, okay, so your models right now are derived, on small, not relatively small data sets, right? So the parameters are very tailored to what you're trying to predict. But when you're trying to analyze a patient out of nowhere, and this patient is very unique and very different than any other patient, and it's experiencing things that are very different, and the physician's trying to make a decision on what's going on with this patient, how do you get the physician to trust your model? There has to be a level of trust from the physician to be able to say, hey, I believe that this is going to give me some prediction, and not that they'll risk their careers to use it. You know what I'm saying? I mean, it could be a career-ending decision for them if they. Correct.
Yes, especially if it's been suggested to them.
Well, liability, yeah. Well.
My stab at that would be actually that I agree with you that parameters are bad where possible, and occasionally they're needed, but every time you add a parameter, I think you have the utility of the algorithm. So I just look at my kind of own career. I've had lots of ideas. Some actually had no parameters, and they get cited and used by people all over the world. And some ideas I thought were very clever, but have 5 parameters to tweak. No one's ever really used them successfully. I think that kind of tells me a lot too. So again, parameters are necessary sometimes, but often you can get very far without them, using things like MDL or other things to automatically set the parameters or to basically remove them from the algorithm. But the issue of trust more broadly, I think, is very interesting. I mean, I know some doctors like decision trees because they see things like that in training. They like this, blood sugar high, temperature low, it's this disease. So I think that issue actually is underexplored. How do you actually gain the trust of the doctor or the clinician? Sorry.
If I can just quickly, I think there were sort of 3 things there, if I can tease them out. One is parameters to the, let's say, call it the learning or estimation algorithm that builds the model, okay, and that's what Eamon was addressing. The second is the model itself is complicated and has lots of parameters, different use of the word parameters, well, somewhat different. And the last is no matter what the thing that comes out is how do you get the doctors to trust it. So on the first one, you aren't expecting the doctors to build it, I hope. I mean, just like you wouldn't expect me to go in and treat your patients. That's scary for everyone involved. So I mean, in other words, you have to have somebody who's trained and understands for this algorithm what is even if it has 1 or 2 parameters, what are their effects and how do you effectively set them and has experience doing that and produces the model. And then the model having a lot of parameters, I don't have as much to say about. We've talked about it before. But then the trust issue, most people trust based on experience, right? So yeah, you set it up by the doctor. You say don't use it or don't use it once. Just watch what it's doing, and over time, you'll get just like a person. You don't trust a person based on. Most people trust people based on contact with that person over and over again. So you produce a device or something that does something, and now you give them a chance to get used to it and to see how it works and that sort of thing over the course of time, and have their colleagues do the same thing. I wouldn't expect anything to be adopted overnight. Take years to do that to build up that trust.
So I just wanted to give an example of Christian just said. So this is interesting because it's almost a precedent for a lot of work that employs algorithms to do. There are no clinical or there are no FDA devices that I know of before this where it was an algorithm that was given FDA approval. But like a few months ago, there was a device that came out of Virginia. They were trying to look at continuous monitor data from just the EKG to be able to predict sepsis within 12 hours of when sepsis happens. And what they did is they basically took this device, and the same thing happened where people were like, how can we trust it? We don't know what's going on. So they said, great. They made this device, and they deployed it in several different NICUs, and they just left it. They didn't tell people. They said, well, this is to help you figure out who's going to have sepsis, but they didn't say what to do with it. They didn't say you should order a test, or you should use it in this way, or you should use it in that way. They just let each NICU figure out on their own how they were going to use that device. And what it turns out is after many years of, they did I don't remember the exact figure, but more than several months of clinical trial, maybe even years, what they found was basically clinicians automatically over time started to trust that device, and basically they would order tests for checking for sepsis when this score would respond in one way versus a different way. And this reduced mortality rate by some significant percentage and reduced length of stay in the ICU by some significant percentage. So it addressed all of the above, where physicians didn't exactly know all the details that were going on. They roughly understood it was looking for patterns in the heart rate. They weren't told what to do. They, over time, figured out what was going to happen. And then the FDA was like, we don't approve algorithms. We want a physical device. Like, what are you measuring? And then this particular thing got approved and now can be used as a precedent for other algorithmic inventions of this type.
This is probably fairly obvious, but adoption is not dependent on the technology as much as who you infect with it. If you infect the right person, it's going to disseminate. If you don't infect the right person.
I would like to add one other thing to this topic, which is that in machine learning therapy, you see people trying to build more understandable models. And inevitably, I think this is kind of a rattle, because you end up compromising prediction performance. And that's just not what you want to do. I think it's much better to follow the approach where you build trust by just advising and seeing and letting people build up the knowledge of, yes, this is actually it's providing interesting advice, and then they start relying on it more and more.
So, how? Go ahead.
I think we have a real problem in talking with doctors because they don't know how to think. They're taught not to think, to train good robots. We think that we teach them clinical good judgment and stuff like that. They are never taught Bayes' theorem. They are never taught the most simple things about decision analysis. They don't even know what decision analysis is. They have no idea of calculating the expected value of a certain course of action and comparing it with something else. This is a real defect in medical education worldwide because of this culture to classify rather than quantify and to follow socially acceptable rituals set up by people who never saw your patient. And yet you're a good guy if you do what they say, who've never seen your patient, and you're a bad guy if you don't. This is a real problem in medical decision making and in clinical approaches to therapy.
I'm all for teaching doctors all about math.
You'd like frustration.
No, I was just wondering, so how important is interpretability for doctors in the audience? Interpretability of...
You mean, so do I need to
Yes.
understand how it works?
Yes.
Or do I have to understand what it means?
Do have an explanation for a prediction, for every prediction?
The magic 8 ball that gets it right most of the
That's
time.
the
Yeah.
Just tell me what to do.
Yeah. Maybe I
Just
do
tell
a
me
magic
what
eight
to
ball.
do. That's the problem. And they don't even want to know.
So
The problem with the curriculum thing. The things we teach get altered by replacement rather than by addition or enhancement. And it's these socially acceptable rituals that are so deadly that need to be replaced instead of forming a groundwork of good science and good decision analysis in the basic process of medical education.
So I think with a number of these tools, you know, the doctor probably at some point was told how, you know, end-tidal CO2 is measured, right? Like, maybe. But at the end of the day, they know what it means, right? It has this clinical meaning in something. And so if you can produce a tool that does that, look, I'm measuring something here. It's, you know, how variable is the heart rate? Do you really want to know the details of how variable it is? But look, it successfully does this, and it's this kind of measure, it's this kind of score. And then you build up trust. I think that's the way of going about it, as opposed to insisting that the doctors understand all the details of every medical device that's placed by the bedside, provided they understand what the outputs mean, you know, at some reasonable level. That seems much more reasonable to me.
You need to understand that outputs have errors. The doctors have never taught that. They never taught what standard deviations are of the various lab measurements.
This is not entirely true. At Caltech, we had pre-med students, and you know, they did a lot of lab work, and they got some sense of that there were errors and so forth.
I've interviewed med school applicants who have come to med school with good math backgrounds and good experience in differential equations and all of that stuff. Third year, bye-bye. It's all gone. They have totally lost.
There's no guarantee they
Totally lost
remember
the
it.
ability to think that way.
I personally
That's
believe
so
that in
tragic.
middle school we should be teaching good decision theory.
Yeah.
I would agree with you qualitatively. I wouldn't go quite as far as 100% unaware of what standard error is standard deviation.
Yeah, how much do you believe that stuff?
Some more questions.
I have to
This isn't the
interject.
time to go into that.
Let's
I really have to interject.
Go.
Sir, can I just ask you your background? I just need to know what your background is.
What's your background?
I was trained as a cardiologist, but I went wrong. And I made the mistake of taking a basic research course in radioisotopes. And during that time, I really learned how much I had been missing in my education. It made me go back and totally re-examine my entire education up to that. And it turns out that the equations of radioactive decay are the simple equations of drug behavior in people. You know, funny thing, nobody ever teaches you that. I go back and I talk about E minus KT and half-time stuff like that, so that's crazy. This is 1966. Nobody gives drugs that way. What's the matter with you? You know, and that, you know, Winston Churchill said, one of the heaviest crosses I have to bear is the cross of Lorraine. You know, and this has been my cross for 40 years. And it's the total non-quantitative aspect of medical thinking that comes from lineage, I think, to classify experiences. And we classify diseases the same way
we invent these horrible criteria for putting a name on a disease, often when it's a quantitative aberration from the normal hypertension. And then do something about it.
Okay, so I'm all happy for reforming, but I think we need to move on to some other things.
And the people approach meeting is in part to try and overcome that barrier.
Exactly. Exactly. But it needs to get to the curriculum committee.
We're working on it.
I have a somewhat simple, maybe simplistic, but I've seen an approach that has worked to solve this problem in other environments. The question seems to be, we build pretty sophisticated models, and how do you get people to adopt them and trust them and so on. So one environment, I've seen several environments where it works well, and here's what they do. For example, at Cisco, right, when they try to solve health of networks, typically you have engineers who know the network, but pretty much like doctors who know patients, but they don't know too much about these sort of things. But they form a group called a knowledge group, which actually is an interface. They may not be the sophisticated mathematical modelers that all of us are here, but they know enough or they're trained enough, so they know enough to understand the model and to interpret it, and they also work with the people who don't know it. So you form a special group, which is almost a translational group, I think. And I found this work in several different contexts. So that might be, so if you think of medical informatics, that may be one way. People have MDs, they also have analytics. So I don't think it's an insoluble problem.
We've got an efficiency of Borg technology.
Efficiency of what?
Borg technology.
Borg?
Borg, B-O-R-G, Borg. Yeah, you have it, not Star Trek.
Yeah.
No, I just wanted to make sure I got the right word before I admitted it. I thought surely here of all places I'm fine. Yeah, but I was unwilling to admit that I understood the word.
Okay, so are there other questions?
Well, I would just suggest that I think as part of building trust, even if people's understanding of the models or the processes are incomplete, the way in which we represent that output also makes a difference. And so can I see, even if I don't understand the relationship, how it varies, in response to changes in other variables that I am familiar with, and whether that's through visualization or other means. I think there are ways when we think about the presentation of this information that might make an impact on this problem.
Yeah.
Just to answer Dr. Megaliver's question, I think how the information presented to us is important, as he was just saying, and involving the physicians, the clinicians in the discussion closer to the beginning, with the idea that our overall goal is to help you solve this problem. I don't need to know, nor can I really understand all of the math, but if you give me an idea of where the direction is going and why, you're going to get more feedback from me, which will help for those of you that do modeling, for those of you that extract features without the information. It will give you a clue as to whether you're meeting those goals.
But you would accept the black box at the end.
I'll accept the output of a black box if I know. No, I don't think so. But it's a historical issue. Every time that there's a new technology developed, you're going to get early adopters and late adopters, and I don't think that's any different than anybody else in this crowd.
There's a probability distribution. You'll get a higher probability of acceptance across the population with the explicit model. Black box model, just on your first blush, you're going to have your people who have trust.
I think there's some great points here that the human-computer interaction aspects, which I have no idea about, actually are very important here. That there probably needs to be some specialist product manager who sits between the computer scientists and the doctors and presents things in a nice way. If you look at spreadsheets when they first came out, there were tools like that beforehand, but somebody made a spreadsheet look like a physical paper spreadsheet, and it was immediately adopted. And so I think we need to have somebody who sits between us and actually essentially translates and makes things non-threatening, friendly, and easy to use, and so forth.
It's also, if I can get man, it's also probably easier with the newer generation. Physicians that are older adopting an electronic healthcare record or an anesthesia record that's not paper is very difficult for many of them to make that transition. But if people see that from the beginning and that's what they're trained with, I think the next generation of clinicians is going to have an easier time relating to people in computer science and working with them.
coming up here.
So, but we live with, if you walk to the bedside of anybody, we live with black box algorithms all the time.
Yes, every one of them.
If the monitor says birth is in PFib, I have no idea how they decided that person was in, or what the algorithm was to identify that pattern. But I look at the patient, and if she's dying on me, then I'm going to believe the monitor. So it's the trust issue is just put it out there. If it works, that's great. And if it doesn't work, we'll ignore it and give it a take away.
I've got 500 boxes I'd like to put out there.
Oversimplified. Because if I see 2 or 3 different measures, and one's saying something's happening, the other 2 aren't in agreement, maybe because the machine's on the fritz, you establish trust through that active triangulation amongst the different signals available.
Exactly. So the algorithm inside the pulse oximeter, I have no idea how it works.
Sure.
But if the pulse oximeter is telling me the SAT's low and the heart rate is 12, I'm going to look for 3 other places to try and validate that. So if the algorithm says birth rate is septic, I'll walk to the bedside and look for 4 other data elements. And it's not a decision tree. We are pattern matching people, and we're looking to match the pattern, which is fundamentally what the model is.
I think we're in violent agreement.
I would like to go back to this issue of trust and substitute something like a glimmer of comprehension rather than trust. Because I don't trust anything, and I don't think anybody really does. But a glimmer of comprehension, knowing that there's a pony in there somewhere, I think counts for a lot rather than
I can believe that.
trust which is blind.
So if you have some sort of mental model of how the black box works, that makes you maybe a bit more comfortable with the black box.
Yeah, yeah.
Go ahead.
To inject politics for a second, the line should be trust but verify. And that's exactly what we're trying to do. Right? You look at it and verify with the other available data.
Just speaking as a data miner, I've worked with entomologists and nematologists and astronomers and whatnot. One way I often gain their trust actually is I tell them to give me data, just black box. I play with it, and I tell them things they already know. And that's not very impressive to them, but they kind of do get some trust in the algorithm that, okay, you recognize this is a binary star, you recognize this is a dying nematode, so you can tell me stuff I already know. I trust you now a little bit more. Now go a little bit deeper and do something useful and novel. So there are ways to kind of get the wedge in and gain trust slowly.
Yeah, I think it would really help to just talk basic decision theory in
I think middle school would be better.
so much.
Really, there's a lot of people I meet that are doctors that need to know a little bit about this.
I know, but you just wait till you start talking to third-year med students compared to what they were like before they got in. Culture is so powerful.
Yeah. So I wanted to give a sense of what data means. So if you have 10 events, like 10 infants that you're monitoring, then you basically, you're basically toast. There's nothing you can do. When you get to 100, maybe you can do something. It's delicate. We get into fights about cross-validation versus backing or whatever. When you get to 1,000 events, then you just do cross-validation, and that works pretty well. And you start to become pretty confident about the result. You get to 10,000 events. That's probably the first level where method 5 can start to work. You have some sort of generic learning algorithm that can just kind of grind through things and start to do useful things. So 10,000 is probably, so envision that kind of approach gets used sometimes, and that you need at least 10,000 examples before you can do something. And then there's a lot of other levels in between, and then recently when there's 10 to the 10 events, I discovered that the precision with which I was outputting the test error was not sufficient, right? And that's a good spot to be in. But so somewhere around 10,000 events, you just switch to having a holdout test set because doing cross-validation is not worth the bother. And then in between 10,000 and 10 billion, it's mostly a computational issue of sort of scaling up. So if we can get to a point where we have standardized data sets of size 10,000, which are a reasonable quantity, then I would expect that you would start to see a lot of things developing in the medical domain.
So if I can, the trick here is what's an event, right? And then that relates to how, so you can get away with fewer events if they are less noisy or more consistent or more coherent or less complex, right? And so, I mean, the order of magnitude still works, but it depends a little bit on your problem and how noisy the problem is and what exactly you want to tease out. Yeah.
So you want to say something?
Yeah, that's actually the point I wanted to make, which is both, three things. For example, when you say 10,000 patients, you might still be wanting to estimate kind of a rare event. Well, it doesn't have to be a rare event, but rare with respect to a patient population of 10,000, which I think is quite prevalent in medical data, in which case, unlike vision, you'd need more. But I think Jen's point is roughly approximately right, that there is some magnitude up until which having that much data is good, and then having much more than that is useful for improving precision, but at least having some basic amount, like 10,000 or 100,000 is reasonable. There is one another thing, which is I think the medical data, it is very heterogeneous. So it is still not clear, unlike vision, where you have one modality, you just have pixels and pixel values. Here, basically, it really is an issue where you have 20,000 different data types, and each data type has its own noise source. So it's hard to think of how easy way you could take out of the box supervised learning algorithm like SVM and drop it on that data. And so I think if we were to do that, then we would need many, many more tens over there. The 10 to the 10 may not be enough.
So I think that for the end-to-end systems, systems of type 5, they're typically not support vector machines. They're typically things like recursive neural networks or like convolutional neural networks like Jan LeCun works on.
But except it wouldn't work on 10 to the 10 events. I mean, his thing probably wouldn't work on 10 to the 10, like data sets that size.
It's a computational issue of training. But it's actually a relatively scalable algorithm as far as training. It does become, there's details. Okay. I don't want to get lost in the details.
So, can I ask a question?
Yeah?
On the end-to-end optimization, if I look at all your objective functions, because just from the presentation, it wasn't clear what sort of objective functions you were using. And typically, you tend to use statistical objective functions, but one often tends to think on this end-to-end optimization of reward of a business or domain-based objective function. So what type of objective functions are you using?
So we were using, essentially log likelihood, so the ability to predict. Okay. So, and that was because we were trying to build a model and we didn't know exactly what we wanted to use the model for. But I think many of these techniques you can plug in something else relatively easily or with a little bit of research or something else. You say, I think the trick, though, is figuring out what that is, trying to get what is the real end goal of this. Can you quantify? And I think Suchi touched on this. Can you even measure that? Can you tell me what the end goal is supposed to be in a quantitative way?
Yeah. So, for example, the model I showed you where I had all these signatures and signatures related to symptoms, the question was, okay, great. This looks like it's interesting. It's giving qualitative results, like Eamon pointed out, to build trust with the physicians. Like, hey, look, you would have expected RDS goes down. We see that RDS is going down, so on and so forth. But then there's always this question of what objective do you use? And risk stratification was one example objective that we used. But you could have used something else. So there's predictive log likelihood is one example of an objective you can use. Or you could take a completely different task like classification performance and see how your model is doing in terms of classification performance. I don't know. I guess it's hard to answer this question without becoming very technical.
My question is coming from many times statistical objective functions are chosen to make life easy. And as soon as you go to a business objective function, then you may start carrying the whole distribution in some manner. So that makes life much more difficult.
I can answer that. So we spent a bit of time figuring out how to reduce complex objective functions into simple objective functions. And I think we have actually a pretty good library of ways to do that. So I'm confident that whatever you can actually state as an objective, we can actually optimize.
Yeah, I would say 10 years ago, I'll say 10 is an arbitrary number somewhat, because I have 10 fingers. Yeah, it was much more like you pick squared error because you know that's equivalent to Gaussian noise, and then we know how to optimize it, right? And I think now the machine learning and data mining community is much better at being able to treat sort of more complex objective functions. Yeah.
Okay, so another topic was methods of experimentation. So when Stuart was asking me a question, I think I didn't quite understand it. So there's sort of the traditional approaches, and then he was actually suggesting kind of a Bayesian approach as an alternative to the approach that Alina talked about, where you have context. And I guess I wanted to, first of all, say that that's what it was, and second of all, say that there's a lot of people who like the idea of Bayesian trials, and I find them a little bit scary because there's a lot of money involved in the system, and that means there are people who are going to try to game any system that you create. And Bayesian approaches are far more gameable than you might realize. So one thing to observe, first of all, is that if you're going to try to do a Bayesian approach which can deal with a large set of policies, you're forced to do approximation because the computational complexities of doing things exactly are exponential in the number of policies. They're exponential in the so it's number of policies to the time horizon. So it's exponential in t. So it's impossible, and so you're forced to do approximation. And then there's a lot of issues with the Bayesian approaches can be proved valid if the prior is actually what the world draws from. But typically you don't even really believe your priors because you choose them for convenience or because you think they make you appear unbiased. And then there's issues because what appears unbiased actually can be very biased because there's always a lot of bias encoded in the actual structure of whatever Bayesian approach you're taking. So I guess I think of Bayesian algorithms as interesting learning algorithms, but I would be afraid to advocate them for improved adaptive clinical trials. I think the contextual trials, the contextual approach that Alina talked about is sounder. It's not nearly as gameable. Yeah?
So I have the same concern, but if it's something people are interested in, the guy who, Sir Rollins, who runs the health service in the UK, has some interesting writings on this topic.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly this topic and exactly geared towards making huge policy decisions and how do we augment our evidence without having to wait, 30 years for an answer that we needed yesterday. So people are specifically interested in that.
Okay. Are there other thoughts?
I have a question then.
Yeah.
Is this contextual trial equivalent to some Bayesian trial? I may ask a slightly related question.
I don't know the answer.
Not one that we know of. I guess even Bayesians, when they're doing just normal supervised learning, have a test set. And this is kind of the equivalent of a test set, right? Unless they're incredibly hardcore, in which case you don't talk to them very much. Yeah. Okay, so there's a good bit about time series analysis. So there is dealing with so how should you deal with time series? One of them is maybe you can kind of learn the dynamics, so you have dynamic Bayes net, or maybe you should do some sort of shape matching type approach, or maybe you want to do a recursive version, recursive version of 2, or maybe there's some other approaches. But it seems like time series are coming up over and over again, and I guess that makes a lot of sense because people just
But also could be selection bias in the people who are presenting here. I said there could be selection bias in the people who are presenting here.
I can believe that, but honestly, I do continue to exist over time, so.
So it's interesting because a lot of the work that's been done in the informatics community has typically ignored all the time series data and only uses snapshot data. So in some sense, we're overrepresenting the stuff that's not canonically done. in terms of research.
We did that.
Yeah, like health informatics or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, so the interesting thing is in bioinformatics, time series data is very hard to get because typically what happens is in order to measure something, you kill it. Right, you take your cell and you try not to do that. That's very kind. You take your cell and you chop it up and measure something about it, and so you can get you can get a time series. You can get sort of like a bunch of things that were run to different times, but it's entirely different than a time series. And so maybe we're all people who got turned away from there and then came over here because you guys have time series data that actually works.
One of the complexities that I don't know how much this exists. I guess it exists in the rest of the world too, but in medicine, we see that something's going bad, and if you're modeling, Randall may pick it up an hour before I pick it up, and I may pick it up an hour before somebody else picks it up. So with the same pattern, we're going to have an intervention that's going to change things, and being able to tease out, the meaning in those patterns when it's got both the patient characteristics in the model as well as the treatment effect. And this varies widely and really shouldn't be included in the model, because if you're going to start creating models that include this element in it, then you're going to get feedback, and it's dangerous.
Yeah, so I addressed that a little bit. I think I started off with the patient as a dynamic system, and actually a more accurate statement is the patient in this bed with these doctors in this hospital and the rest of it, that whole thing is a dynamic system, and I think you have to measure the whole thing, which includes measuring the interventions and the rest if you really want to understand how that dynamic system works and where you can go make your own interventions or controls or something else. So, yeah.
Well, modeling how intervention change the responses over time is precisely what happens in the ICU. You come up with a mental model of what's wrong with the patient and try it there. It sounds like trial and error. But you also, in fact, that is the model of medicine. It's always an experiment. Even if you have an earache and the doctor gives you an antibiotic, he doesn't say, I don't need to see you again. He says, in 2 weeks, I want to make sure it works. There's no certainty that works. So that simple therapy and outcome is still an experiment, even if the outcome is not certain. So you observe, and if it didn't work, then you treat it wrong.
So when you have these unknowns, it just turns out that psychologically, people are not very good at dealing with unknowns. So it's very common, for example, that whatever the most likely cause is kind of assumed to be the cause until proved otherwise, right? And so there's not a good modeling of the other rarer but more common things. And a lot of learning algorithms are actually decent at that if you tune them right. So there's a real potential to cope with the uncertainty, which is inherent in this process, better using some amount of database reasoning or database learning.
This is a question for you. I guess everyone's been doing more discrete time models, and I guess you emphasize continuous time models. So if you have textual or other evidence, right? So then essentially in a discrete models you just have a big big jump, because that can change evidence significantly. But you have a false control type things because of cascade control. So how do that big thing?
So if I may, I'm going to rephrase your question a little bit if I can. So the question is when I have observations that are impulses essentially, right? How do I deal with that? Okay, so I guess because I'm not observing a state, right? The observation itself is some impulse that happened. Okay, so you can do that. What you do is that you tie some non-dynamic system model that says, well, you have a non-dynamic system model that says when such a thing would actually happen, and that's just sort of like a switching state on a toggle variable. And then you tie the observation to when that thing happens through some sort of standard, a probability model. Like, given that an observation gets made here, here's the distribution of the observation, and then you can incorporate that back in. It doesn't look like evidence on the continuous variables. It looks like fuzzy evidence on the continuous variables, and you can go do the whole thing. So I guess the quick answer is there's math to take care of it. It's not a big problem, but you have to work around it. Yeah. We did that. Just to be clear, we have done that for some other models like the network traffic event models. Like you have these pulses of network traffic events, which are clearly not continuous, and so we've built continuous time models to deal with that.
Okay, I think we should probably finish up because it's getting on towards lunchtime. But the last two topics that I had to discuss were data related, and I think that probably everybody in this room is convinced that we need data, and it makes an enormous difference going from even 100 to 10,000 events, right? It makes an enormous difference in terms of our ability to model. And I think the limiting factor, as far as I can tell, is the data, and not. I mean, we have lots of algorithms for modeling in various ways, and we'll develop more as we get better data that allows us to actually tell we need new models. But the data is a limiting factor, and we need to deal with privacy. I like the idea of having an opt-in. It's a technique that we use at Yahoo to some extent, so you can choose to share some data or not. And then, of course, having some sort of NEH-sponsored petabyte cluster, which you can actually use to do computation on large amounts of data, and also to control access to the data to some extent, is perhaps an effective approach. And then I guess there was a comment earlier that you need to promote a culture of sharing data, which, as far as I could tell, a lot of the failure to share data comes from greed reasons, and so you want to change the rules, and maybe the great scientific boards that are envisioned in the healthcare will eventually get to that, but there needs to be some serious change in the culture to promote sharing of data.
I will say that machine learning has successfully been applied to a number of other areas. Computer vision is one. I mean, you almost can't see a computer vision paper now that doesn't have a machine learning component. Right. And natural language processing is another. Right? It used to be natural language processing involved almost no statistics or these sorts of things, and now you can't find a natural language processing paper that isn't deeply embedded in machine learning practically. And speech recognition or what else. And the big change is when there came on large corpora of data. Right? When you could crawl the web and get large sections of text, suddenly text processing became a statistical crime. When images became easy to pass around and such, suddenly you got machine learning people supplying good results there. And so I think it's sort of, you might worry about the quality of the data and other sorts of things; those can be improved. But sort of bring the data and the researchers will come.
So I just wanted to say one thing. So for the people who are really anxious and want to do it before the culture changes or wait for the culture change to happen, there are actually data sets available, large data sets available publicly for clinical data. So for example, NIH gave a really large grant to MIT and Harvard 10 years ago, I think, and they created the MIMIC data set, and it's basically at least 20,000 patient data, I think, from the ICU setting for adults. And they have a lot of, they have basically labs and discharge summaries and...
So is there any central location which has a list of these data sets?
I can, there's no, I mean, this is just stuff that I've discovered over time from looking around. There isn't a page that I know that you can go to look at publicly available data sets, but they maintain their data set very nicely. I mean, their program is now discontinued, so they're kind of doing it out of charity. Mm-hmm. But the point is, nevertheless, there was 5 to 10 years of NIH, solid NIH funding that went into this project. And so there's precedence for it. There's another one, and I mentioned this to Alina yesterday. It's called ADNI, and it's for Alzheimer's. And because Alzheimer's is relatively, well, it's not rare, but, it's not as prevalent as diabetes, the NIH again put in a lot of money across many centers across UK, Canada, US to be able to collect very controlled data and put it all up in a single place. So if you go to the ADNI network, you can, and that's also time series. So it's pretty fascinating because it's time series. It's got lots of different types of modalities like image data and reports and all that stuff. So there are some. They're not as many, but they exist.
Can you spell that?
ADNI, and the first one is MIMIC, MIMIC.
So it would be good to maybe have a web page somewhere with pointers
I've
of
been
this sort.
thinking about it. I was making one, but I just was
One
busy
thing I would
with
say about the mimic data, because I downloaded it, I have it, and it turned out they had exactly the same data mark that we have, so it's structured exactly the same. There's a difference between, it's one thing to take your data and put it on the web and say, here you go. It's another thing to put it out there in a way that people actually want to use it. Any of these folks who might be curious and decide, I'm going to go get that data, would go and download it, and they would find that it's an enormously complicated data model, and that there's going to be a whole lot of grunt work that some undergrad or grad student is going to have to do to process it. And it's a huge time investment. And so, I mean, I'm not disparaging what they've done, but I think if you really do want people to use your data, you're going to have to do some of that work. You're going to have to help. You're going to have to collaborate with people and come up with actual tasks and prepare the data sets. Because it's in computer vision, NLP, things like that, you can just go download data sets that you can load right into MATLAB that are ready made to do whatever analytical task you want to do.
So actually, I think for Mimic, they've improved quite a bit over the years, and they have this site called PhysioNet, which I'm sure you're aware of. And I've downloaded the data and been able to use it myself. And now maybe it appears easy to me because I put in the effort to set up the Stanford system, so I know how much worse that was. Yes. But I think it's like 2 weeks of work at most to be able to get access to 20,000 pretty detailed records. So
so I guess the question is, can you get the 2 weeks down to like 5 minutes or something?
Yeah, maybe. I think that would be valuable. But I don't think it should prevent people from using it. I think people should go use it. It's really valuable. A lot of money went into tax dollars went into putting it up.
I think a lot. So you have to make a very deliberate decision to invest 2 weeks if you want to do this.
I'm really saying 2 weeks for people who really don't know how to program and want to take a great deal of time and lots of coffee breaks.
Okay.
It's really not that bad, I think.
But
I do think
even if it's only a day for somebody who's in the know, it's still, you have to make a pretty deliberate decision to do it. And a lot a people are not
But
that
I think
deliberate,
we're arguing
right?
about
so they can just kind of
no data to
a
a
week.
week.
And they start going up the learning curve.
Yeah, true. But I think really from no data to a week's worth of work, I don't mind that. But no data is the bigger problem, right? Because most of the times there is just no data.
So yeah, that's true. So in NLP and vision, one thing that happened was there were data sets with established problems that were of interest.
Yeah.
Right? Like I want to find pedestrians in images, right? And you can argue that's not the most interesting thing to do with images, but at least got a bunch of people figuring out how they could look at images and do things with them. And images is a very standard data thing. Everyone understands images. And so those sorts of standards, here's a problem, and here's a data set where I can easily format it so that you can, pull it into MATLAB in 5 minutes, help get a community involved. And then once they have that, then they're willing to go try to invest 2 weeks to understand a more complex data set or try to figure out, that's not the problem I wanted to solve, this is the one I should be solving.
The other difference is you can reshare other data. So in the case of the Mimic2 data, you have to get permission from them to use it. So if you happen to do all the legwork to process it for doing some kind of particular predictive task, there may be a lot of other people out there who would be, if you were to take your processed data and put it on the web, a whole bunch of people would go download it overnight because they're like, oh, this looks really interesting, which is what happens in NLP images and stuff. And you don't see that as much in medical data because the access is much more.
Well, but you could supply a program which would transform that data
into
something, right, and supply that. Say, and then you have to follow this link to get the data. Now run this on that, and then you've got something. That's fine.
I will give PhysioNet credit because they do that. They are doing code sharing, which is kind of nice.
There was a question in the back.
A humble request, since there are so many people there with the expertise in transnational data, complex data, and such. As on date, would anybody be willing to, the way you have open source code, right? Would anybody be willing to build an open source biomedical data community, which at least for a while can be led by Suchi, for example, who
Absolutely not.
Any job should take much time.
That's right.
worked on data and know the hardships and incompleteness of it and all of that.
I volunteer full professors to do it, though. But go ahead.
That's going to keep jumping.
Where I come from, we've got a rule: if you come up with a great idea, it's yours to run with.
Okay, what's your name? What's that?
Can you type his email address up on
Okay, so So you should maybe talk to people down here. I mean, there's a lot of people who are enthusiastic about getting the data together, and I think whatever can be done to get some data together into a standard web page and start building community is going to be helpful, right? Okay. Yeah?
I'm hearing a lot from the data users and data. We are data creators. Our company has 2 years worth of data now from 3 medical centers, and I'm rolling it out in Mount Sinai, in Cedar Sinai, getting a lot of data in from cardiac cath labs, cardiovascular labs, and EP labs. So what I need someone to tell me is what kind of data models would be good for you. How do I take my data and give it to people to do something with it? And this is why I came here, this is another thing is to find people to do something with our data. We have gathered data now, and we know it's valuable, and I hope I'm not missing some critical element that I'm not measuring. You know what I'm saying?
I think what you're saying, I mean, you're the upstream part of these guys.
Yeah.
So we've got to systematize, I mean, so yesterday we'll talk about this afternoon, the whole capture, access, configuration, manage that data so we can make it available downstream to mining and application users so you can close the loop with measure.
So I think Jeff had it right to some degree. The first thing is, I don't know, doesn't matter, put it out there. And I can't tell you until I see the data. And then, we can iterate on what the format is, dump it someplace, and, we can work out a schema for it or something else later that makes sense. But we're so early stages, I'm not sure, we're going to be able to sit down and plan out some schema, and that has to be measured, that has to be measured. And you're never going to measure everything anyway, so, don't worry too much about that.
I think there's some level of standardization structure.
Sure, you can't.
Having come from my NASA experience, if you put got bad data and you get a reputation for bad data, get that done.
Bad data is different than
unstructured
data. Yeah.
Okay.
Bad data.
Question here?
I think this whole standardization thing can kind of put people on a timeline that doesn't allow them to be more time frame. And the technology to collect this data advances every year. And if you're forced so much to be standardized to a point in time, then you're going to lose more of the data.
The other thing is, no matter what the data comes in, I'm going to reformat it from my algorithm anyway. I'm not going to take your data format and use it raw. I mean, I'm going to do some processing on it, and maybe it'll be light. Maybe I'll move the algorithm to the data and do it there. But I'm not going to, I guarantee you're not going to put it in a data format that I want in particular. So it has to be understandable. It has to have metadata so that you understand what the things are, and you have to understand how it was measured and all this sort of thing. Yeah, that has to be there. But concerning too much about, do I make this table reference this table or something else is not.
I think what we see more and more with people in planetary science is that you want to be able to put your data in some sort of homogeneous kind of structure that people can then take out and read into their tools. And they're going to reformat it, and they're going to process it, and they're going to pull it out, and those things. But if you've got data delivered in 23 different formats, a lot of our scientists have spent a good part of their grants just reformatting data.
Sure. And that's because someone decided to make it, not just dump it out as a text file, but to make this one structured, and this one structured this way, and this one structured this way, instead of just saying, here it is in sort of it's the most simple format, and then here's information how it was collected and how you maybe correlate it with something else. But
the search for standardization, I think, also relates to software design and maturation. And I know some places which have very rigorous software validation procedures. And I think sometimes they wind up having great software for yesterday.
Yeah.
And there's a trade-off in there somehow to keep the software moving and evolving. And I think oftentimes some of these things can be quite restrictive in the way software develops.
Yeah. My impression is for medical domain, especially if we're using the data in an interesting way, we don't even really know how to standardize it, so we should just try to start doing something.
Yeah.
Did you have a question? No? Okay. All right. So I think we should maybe go to lunch.
By the way, great panel, and John, you did a fantastic job.
Thanks.
Excellent job.